and welcome back after lunch. We are very pleased to have with us Mr. Aamer Hussein and Bilal Tanweer for it's called In Conversation With, and let me just get the title, 1 minute, Mirror of the Mind. Aamer Hussein has had a very interesting career, and he has been a writer, studied Persian, Urdu and history at SOAS, published 6 acclaimed collections of short fiction, and is also a regular columnist, also published short fiction in Urdu in Dunya Zaad, and a regular columnist for the book pages of Dawn, as well as writing regularly for The Independent. And he has the title story, Fires in an Autumn Garden, published by OUP, is by Aamer Hussein, and he's also contributed to anthologies like Dragonfly in the Sun and Leaving Home. Bilal Tanweer is a writer and translator and one of Granta's New Voices, as well as a recipient of the PEN Translation Fund grant for his translation of the book Chakiwara Mein Visal, which is a forthcoming venture. His debut novel, The Scatter Year is Too Great, was published last year and won the 2014 Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize. And he has also been shortlisted for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature 2015. So over to them for this session. Thank you.
Do we have any sound yet? Yes.
Just one more announcement. Please turn off your mobiles or put them on silent so that the session is not disturbed by the bells ringing. Thank you.
I think it's working now. Thank you. It's my very great pleasure to be hosting this conversation with Aamer Hussein. And I'm sure you've already heard his extensive list of publications. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to talk to Aamer about not only his fiction, but his broader intellectual life. So I'm just going to start this conversation off very quickly with the question of multiple languages and the worlds of multiple languages that Aamer inhabits. I think from the biography that was just read out, you probably gleaned that he's officially very well known for his command over English, Urdu, and Farsi. But the other languages that were not mentioned were our Romance languages, Italian. He even writes in Italian, French, and Spanish. So, let's start the conversation off with that, Aamer, perhaps. What do you think is your relationship with such diverse languages, and what sort of pleasures do these languages afford you perhaps as a reader first and then as a writer?
Well, I think the funny thing is my first few short stories were actually written in Italian. Not because I was so fluent in Italian that I thought in it, but because I was trying to learn it. So I thought that was a good way of trying to practice my skills. And of course, by beginning to write in a language, you also learn what it doesn't give you. And obviously Italian for me had no resonances of my cultural past. French is the language I was passionate about. I started to learn it later at about 24, I think, while I was studying Persian. And French literature gave me, again, a lot more than probably any other had until that time. I'm still very attached to French literature. Again, with French literature, there was the sense that when I went into reading North African writing from France, that had much more resonance for me than writing from anywhere else. Writers like Asya Jabbar, later Tahar Ben-Jelloun, there were many others. And I think that those languages, strangely enough, rather than westernizing me as a writer, drew me back to my non-Western past, which is right here in this city. I was born here, grew up here till the age of 13. My father and grandfather were both born here. At the same time, I had studied Urdu literature at university, not language. We had 1 year where we studied modern Urdu, before that I did the classics. I don't think I would ever have known quite as much about Urdu classics if it hadn't been for that enforced period of study. I grew up, I suppose, effectively bilingual. Urdu was spoken around me. English was a language I was entirely educated in, and I think that for much of my life, early life, the nightmare was this phrase, Urdu bolo, Urdu padho, Urdu sikho. We used to run from it because it was, used as a kind of ruler to whip our knuckles with, to rap our knuckles with, after we'd been told at school not to speak Urdu, which I think is a good recipe for schizophrenia. I think like many of my generation, I grew up completely schizophrenic, having certain feelings in Urdu, but always expressing myself in English, and always felt a muddle. So in a way, all those other languages were escapes, And then the question began to arise later when I began to write about whether I was translating from Urdu and whether this supposed poetic sensibility I had in my work was actually borrowed from Urdu. It wasn't. I think it was borrowed from this muddle of languages in my head, So sometimes when I sound as if I'm writing English like a foreigner, it's because I was probably thinking in French while I wrote it. I think we can come back to that later, but that's, I think, enough of a mix-up for now. Well, Spanish somehow entered the brew as well. I studied Spanish for a while. I read Spanish books in Spanish. Persian is a family language, so I knew some of it anyway before I started to study it. I was taught to read Rumi in the original by my mother at about 14, starting off with the first verse of the Masnavi. And funnily enough, I didn't run away from that the way I had run away from Urdu bolo, Urdu sikho, Urdu paro.
But what about writing in, how many languages? So 3 languages you've written in?
I could probably properly write only in English until I was 17 or 18. I can write in Hindi as well. I can write in Hindi. I can't write in Hindi. But yeah, I mean, the only one I could express myself in properly was English until I experimented with Italian. And then realized that there was always a flexibility and that there's probably an internal language, a mental language that you have, which is not any one language that can be codified. A lot of writers will tell you that they don't think in words, they think in images. I'm not quite aware of whether I think in one or the other, but I think the image comes first.
How interesting. And again, it's very interesting that what you've just said, with languages, you also don't get a number of things. And that ties in very interestingly with what you've just said about images and the act of seeing. Because every act of seeing is also an act of not seeing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, perhaps, what I'm interested in knowing is, what do you think? I mean, what gets left out, perhaps, when you write in a Romance language as opposed to writing in Urdu?
I found that writing in the Romance language is probably much more akin to writing in Urdu, and I discovered that when I saw these Arab writers, Lebanese and North Africans, using French as a medium of expression. They managed to bring in all kinds of melodies and lyricisms from Arabic. And I always wondered whether one could do that with Urdu. It's difficult to see because being bilingual, at least orally bilingual, you can't judge where the influence of one thing comes into another. I do know what gets left out. I remember having this conversation with the great Urdu writer Qurrat al-Haidar when I was fairly young. And she said, well, the thing that happens with Anglophone writers is that they leave out a lot of emotion that is superfluous and excessive in Urdu. And I said to her, but you're a very spare writer. You write very simple prose for an Urdu writer, very concise prose for an Urdu writer. And she turned around and said in Urdu, no, I've got a lot of tam-tam in my writing. And she says, I didn't perceive her as being that way, but she perceived herself as being that way. So perhaps there is something about a loss of emotional depth. For me, Urdu is a concise language. For me, Urdu can give you very neat short phrases and a variance of tone and rhythm, which is quite beautiful. And then, of course, there's the spoken language that people like Ismet Chughtai excel in, which is full of, ironies, jokes, sarcasm, hints, and innuendos. And I think those, when you're trying to relate a conversation in English, are lost.
That's very interesting, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about writing perhaps across languages, but before we talk about that, I think perhaps it might be better to talk a little bit about your intellectual biography. Reading across such varied languages. Who were the writers, fiction, non-fiction, that philosophers that were important to you at different points
Yeah.
in your life?
As a teenager, before moving to England, definitely Sartre and Alberto Moravia. But Alberto Moravia only because he was a grown-up writer whom I found on my aunt's shelves. And there was something slightly sleazy about what he wrote. And I think as a young teenager, particularly at that time in a small town on a very long holiday, it kind of filled up my imagination with this landscapes of life in Italy of the 30s and 40s. Sartre always sort of appealed to me for other reasons, which I was to discover later. If I can jump ahead a little bit, I had to study Sartre in French, in the original, in my 20s. And that was the philosophical element of Sartre and his writing. James Baldwin was an early influence, and I think I learned a lot about first-person writing from him. Going on, there was the Italian writer Natalia Ginzburg, French writer Marguerite Duras, several philosophical influences. Again, I had to study Heidegger and Husserl because after my BA in Urdu and Persian and so on, I also studied philosophy and psychoanalysis.
I see.
I had to do Lacan as well. So yeah, I mean, existentialist stuff was quite an influence. Later, much later, Edward Said, I think, gave a very clear picture of how we were taught to see ourselves through the eyes of others. Interestingly, we're having this conversation with Nandara Segal this morning as well. So I think that certainly in the mid-80s, Edward Said would have been an abiding influence, not on my style or on my choice of material, but on the way I began to look at reading literature. And I think that practice of reading is extremely important for a writer. It's what grounds us in what we do. So.
Which means reading against how things are presented to you.
Exactly. And there was a strange thing of reading a lot of work that was written by Europeans who had grown up in Africa or France, Vietnam or India, and then switching perspectives to read how the same landscape was demarcated or articulated by writers who belonged there, and perhaps in their own languages.
There was a question that I just forgot related to what you just said, but I'm just going to, hopefully it's going to come back to me. What I'm very interested in, again, I think as one writes, as one kind of grows older, develops as a writer, what age did you start writing?
Seriously?
Yeah.
I sat down and finished something that I thought was a short story at the age of 30.
Okay.
I had written stuff before that, and to my chagrin, a lot of it is in drawers. So I find them from time to time. I can neither get rid of it nor bear to reread it, but it does make me suffer when I see lines from it. The first story that was going to become publishable eventually was at the age of 30. So I'm a late starter.
Yeah, but I think what's important perhaps is the intentionality that you wanted to get to the end of a story.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it didn't reach its end, actually. I mean, that end was tacked on later. But it seemed complete. It seemed as if it said everything I wanted to say. And it seemed as if I had finally broken the mold of the realistic short story.
What I would want you to sort of talk a little bit about is how your subjects have changed as you've worked your way, I don't want to say up, but worked your way through your writing.
I don't know if it is ever up or down. It's sideways.
That's true.
But I was told when I went to Dhaka last year that an old friend of mine who is a colleague from SOAS, an academic, would be interviewing me. This is my introduction to a Bangladeshi audience reading in English. And she looks at me and she says, you've been writing the same story for the last 20 years. People come, go, meet each other. They come and they go and then meet each other. And they cross a few borders and they end up in the same place and then meet each other and then they part. And before I had time to say anything, there was a poet sitting in the audience, Kaisar Bhai. And he says, but isn't that what all fiction is about? Another time I was on this Pakistani chat show, a morning show where I had powder put on my face and I was told I had to speak in Urdu. This was about 2 years ago. And the lady who was with me decided that she was going to try to deflate me in every possible way by saying how she was writing stuff that was deeply rooted in social consciousness, and as someone who lived abroad and so on and so forth, this is what we should practice. And people like me, the hint was, well, just working on the surface. So the lady turned around, the lady who was interviewing me and getting more and more out of her depth looked at me, it's Aamer sahab, aap kya likhte hain? I said, aap kiske baare mein likhte hain? I just looked and I said, ishq aur maut. And in the end, I think that's also what it's about, So.
Yeah, I think I was once asked a question like that, and I think I quoted, this line that I read somewhere, which was, there are only two stories in the world. Somebody takes a journey or a stranger comes to town.
Yeah, in a way, but of course things change. I mean, recently I've been quite obsessed with a whole kind of altercation within one mind between faith and doubt. How one looks at, and I think a lot of The Swan's Wife is about that, as far as I'm concerned. I don't know how many the readers get it, but that was what led me from one story to another in terms of sequence. They seem to have no relationship with them, but I would find myself over and over again coming to this question, whether it was between friends or between lovers, an atheist and a believer, or some kind of believer, or the birth of faith, or some inkling of longing or yearning for a source. That kind of thing became very important as I grew older. I look back and I see it was incipient in a lot of what I was doing before, but I think it's the world we've lived in for the last 10 years particularly.
Can you speak to that perhaps a little bit, like how the world, that you're living in kind of is leaking into your work, or do you...
Yeah, I mean, like I remember saying to somebody, oh God, every time you pick up your pen, somebody wants, or go to the computer, somebody wants you to write about terrorists, veils, and a few other things you can add to them as we talk. And I don't do that stuff. And then when I read my stuff, I see there are references to those things. I mean, they're ironically there, they're veiled, they appear as dreams and so on and so forth, but they are there, this kind of obsession that those who look at us have with this supposed world we inhabit.
Yeah.
But I think it comes in through the back door, as it were.
That's right, yeah. The other conversation that we were having earlier, I made a comment about there is a particular kind of a sensibility that's present in your work. And again, I see that kind of a sensibility, which is very similar to some of the Chekhovian work, and Aamer pointed out that he's not a huge Chekhov fan.
Oh, but I love Catherine Mansfield. I can tell you that. You see,
more than makes up for it, I think.
We professionals save things for the audience, as you know. They're pulled out of that. So Catherine Mansfield is supposed to be a disciple of Chekhov.
That's right. No, all of them. I think everybody eventually traces themselves one way or the other back to Chekhov. So I cited the end of Lady with the Pet Dog, or Lady with the Little Dog, where Chekhov offers us a beautiful ending, which is about these lovers who are eventually together. They are okay with the fact that they are in love. Both of them are married separately to different people, and they cannot reveal themselves to be lovers. But Chekhov at that point, the final sentences of his story are saying the real tests and the real difficulties are just about to begin, and they don't even know it. And that's the end of his story. So I'm very interested in, and I think that's the kind of an ending that Aamer's stories offer again and again. They offer you this beautiful kind of an ending where people kind of come together, but there is no closure there, right?
There isn't in life.
And that final gesture is gesturing to something else. And I'm very curious for you to talk, perhaps, for you to talk to that choice, perhaps.
What happens after the stories?
But just this...
Another story.
But just this kind of a gesture that you make at the end of...
I know it sounds really naive, but the thing is, a story reaches its own end. You're writing it and you suddenly don't want to go any further with the characters, so you start looking at what might be a significant line or a significant feeling to end it at. And of course, when you're kind of struggling as a younger writer to discover the trajectory of the story, you might end with a poem or a line borrowed from elsewhere to close it. Later on, as you kind of learn your craft, you begin to create and generate your own endings, which are very often imaginative rather than placed in the real world. A moment of insight, an epiphany, a moment of being. I mean, these are all platitudes we use in creative writing classes, but we created them after they began to happen, I think. So I think that that's where you leave your protagonist in a story. At some moment which might not even seem significant to her or to him, but which the reader might see as a moment that will release them into another life beyond the page and take them further. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's a very elegant summation, actually. I was trying to reach for something like that. But perhaps would you like to read some of the work, and then we can maybe talk about your, I don't want to use the word vision, but perhaps that.
Okay. Well, a few years ago, I had a book published, a fourth collection of short stories called Insomnia. That was 2007. And I had a wonderful publisher who was Lebanese, francophone, and decided at some point that she wanted to write in Arabic as well. So like me, she was very muddled and so on. And the whole thing with me had always been, when's the novel? And I always said, there is no novel, there will be no novel. In fact, there had been 2 aborted novellas, but whoever wants to talk about that. Both had found their way into my collections as short stories after I threw away masses and masses and masses of stuff. Mai used to tell me, just give me 60 pages and I'll publish a book. And people will know that you can tell a long story. She died in February of that year, very suddenly. I saw her on Saturday with copies of her new book, and on Wednesday and Saturday she was dead. And somehow the next story I wrote became that 60-page story to begin with. That was what she had wanted, and it's dedicated to her. And it's called Another Gulmarg Tree. I don't know if anybody in the audience knows it, but funnily enough, it's one of my most popular books in Pakistan, from the evidence of what readers write to me about it. It's largely set in Karachi. It's about an English woman who comes here, married to a Pakistani man. She's an illustrator, he's a writer. They meet in England and travel to Pakistan. So this is just the middle section, somewhere from the middle section of the book, just showing you their encounter, something about their encounter. The part that's set in England is it is seen through the eyes of the English woman, observing her Pakistani friend, who then becomes her husband. And the Pakistani part is through his eyes, looking at his wife settling in Pakistan. Horrible to explain one's own books, but the first time I saw snow here, I drew my curtain at 7 in the morning, and it was coming down in flakes as big as the palm of your hand. The trees were capped in snow, and the tops of buses, and a man in a coat went by looking like a walking snowman. And another with an umbrella looked like a snowy scarecrow. I went to work in that weather, slipping and sliding. But now you're in London, haven't even considered staying on, at least a little longer than just a year allotted to you. And what would I do here? This was only one of the many questions she put to him that evoked a puzzled or bemused response. She tentatively suggested that they should collaborate in a translation of some of his stories she thought she might send to an acquaintance who worked for a left-wing journal. After all, Mulk Raj Anand and Ahmed Ali had been lauded by Bloomsbury, encouraged by Forster, and published here before the war. Usman could dictate English versions, she suggested, which she'd type and improve. I just couldn't convey the voices in my head in English, he answered. And who'd want to know about my people here? His written English, a third language which he had only acquired in Delhi in his 20s, was clear and sharp, but occasionally stilted. One day Lydia asked over a cup of tea at Lyons why he had never attempted to write fiction in it. He responded, I can't even write in Punjabi, my mother tongue. You don't choose the language you write in, it chooses you. The language of Lydia's craft was, of course, the language of colours and forms. Green woods and water meadows, ducks and swans, horses and sheep, the familiar sights of Hampshire, where she had spent much of her childhood, had opened her eyes to the world around her and made her want to paint. Often, though, she'd felt that her eyes, captivated by what they saw, kept her living in a continuous present tense, which was devoid of longing for anything other than its own pleasures. Then again, the wistful whites, greens, and blue-greys she used to paint her lakes, ponds, and rivers, and the lonely smallness of the people inhabiting her scenes, carried within them a sense of something beyond the immediacy of what her vision framed. Often alone, she wondered whether written words came from a different place, of memory perhaps, that didn't depend on the eyes at all, She searched for the words to speak of these things to him, but she'd stutter and fall silent and ask him about his stories instead, though she sometimes felt that he would tell her stories merely because she asked, and merely because they were just about the only thing in creation that carried him away.
Thank you. Can you speak a little bit about the vision?
Well, I think this wasn't a bit about, it was a bit about vision. It's about a woman who only sees things in images and can only try to replicate the images she sees. And a man who feels he's blind, and he's obsessed with this line by Ghalib, "Chasham ko chahiye har rang mein waah ho jana." And he spends his whole life trying to work out why Ghalib said this, and he can't really understand. And finally, I think he realized that seeing is not about visuals or images, it's about what he sees through his, inner eye or whatever as a writer. So he feels he's always been dry and sterile because he hadn't understood exactly what it was like to weep. I don't know if that's
but maybe can you...
Yeah, we become more emotional as we grow older, I think. We
Yeah.
detach ourselves from our subjects, but we also feel them quite deeply. And I think you should never sit down to write at the age of nearly 60 unless you really have something you want to say.
Uh-huh.
Not to tell, that's very different.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. You talked a little bit about the comment that lady made in Dhaka is quite interesting because I think I made a similar comment, but my point was particularly about space because my own writing is informed by a particular engagement with a particular physical space. But I think what I see in your writing is that physical space become less and less important, and what becomes more and more important in your writing is relationships and how
They've always been very important. They've always been primary.
So I just want you to speak to that a bit, perhaps.
Yeah, I can speak about it technically, I suppose, because one of the challenges I think that the poet and the short story writer have in common is how much can be said in how short a space. And actually we keep thinking of compressing rather than elongating. And for that, the emotion has to come down to the absolute minimum and make the most impact it possibly can. Which means that sometimes space can become superfluous. And for example, when I sat down to write my first Urdu short story, it was very, very short because I wanted to set myself the challenge of only writing within a page. I decided because in early Urdu fiction, this kind of abstract fiction that they wrote in the 70s and 80s, places were always also abstracted. And there was the technical feat of writing words like York, Paddington, Waterloo in the Urdu script, which look hideous. I mean, can you imagine it? Yark, Paddington. So I thought, just dump these words, throw them away, and write a place that the eye can see without it being designated or named. When I passed that story to my Italian translator, who works directly from Urdu as well as from English, he gave it back to me and I said, well, they're not forts, they're not castles in that place, they're forts. He said, so which place is this? I said, it's York. And he said, well, you didn't tell me it was York, and I don't care because as a translator, I'm creating my own version of the place you gave me. I think in some way that answers your question. Yes. I just need the essentials of the locations people are in rather than the whole life of a place. Having said which, I did try to give some sense of the life of the 60s in particular parts of Karachi in the novella. But that's because it has more pages in which to do that.
I mean, that's very, very interesting to me because that suppression of cultural markers, of physical markers, has interesting effects. I mean, one way of reading that could simply be that you are also writing against certain practices of reading.
Yeah.
Right?
Definitely.
And then the other effect that has is a slightly kind of a technical effect where, perhaps Calvino would say that this gives lightness to your writing. It takes away the weight from your fiction.
Yeah. And you see how many Urdu short stories from a certain time and how many Japanese or Chinese short stories from a time will never mention the name of a place.
Yeah.
Every village, every mansion, every city is every city, every village. In fact, I remember when I was first reading Angan by Khadija Mastur in my early 30s, I imagined that was set in Karachi because that was the place I knew.
Yeah.
And it was only much later I realized that she lived and worked in Lahore.
Yeah.
But I had really, to this day, I cannot remove that story from my vision of it being set in Karachi. So.
That's very interesting. Um, okay.
So we create our own places, you know, as readers as well, I think.
I mean, can you speak? I mean, you've already have spoken a little bit about writing novels and writing short stories, but I do understand that's one of your favorite subjects to kind of think about and talk about. I certainly, because it came back to me, because I think we've had this conversation back in 2008 as well. And I thought it was a great conversation because you talked a lot about, you know, not of being a short story writer and how much you love short stories. Can you say a little bit about that?
I guess my first love is poetry. And I have so many people who have said to me that they would die to write one line like Ghaleb or one line like Baudelaire or whatever. And I think I would actually die to write one good poem. I haven't written a single good poem in my life. I've published a few. And I think that brevity matters a lot to me. I'm not hung up on the conventions of what's called the short story form. I think certain theories were invented avant la lettre. About
After the fact.
Yeah, after the fact, about the short story, that it should have, you know, unities of time, place, and action. That's to do with Greek drama. It's to do with presenting things on a stage. It's not got to do with with what happens on the page. The short story is about memory half the time anyway, and it plays incredible games with inner space. I wonder if the novel can actually maintain that to quite the same extent, that experiment with time and so on. It has to have a certain degree of linearity, which was what I learned when I wrote a novel for the first time, and I had used a circular technique when used in short stories, and my very young editor told me that time, oh, but she died, and then she's back, she's alive again on page 17, and I said, yeah, but that's another area of her life, and she said, no, that's not the way it works in a publishable novel. I knew that, but I mean, I was also taking risks with it. But that kind of linearity bores me at any length. Following the lives of characters and the facts of their lives bores me at any length. Being enclosed in one world of sensibility bores me at any length. My head carries in it, when there are stories in it, at the moment there aren't many because I seem to be living them, it carries many stories at the same time, and I can only think of writing one the way it comes to me and then writing another which is usually stylistically and formally completely different. Though, as I think I tried to express earlier, it might have some link that I then discover after reading both of them together. They might be linked by, you know, a particular preoccupation in my mind. So. But brevity is of the essence for me.
I mean, what you say about short stories is actually very interesting. I mean, you say most of the time they're about memories.
Not most of the time, but much of the time you see that the short story has this kind of...
Yeah, I'm thinking about it, and I think it sounds true to me because for the longest time I've been a huge lover of short story, and I've now, I think for the last 2 or 3 years, I've shifted most of my reading toward novels and long form. But I think that, you know, there's something to be said about the role of epiphany as well as a central kind of a device, if you want, in short stories, because, you know, short stories in some way hinge upon the epiphany, you know, all the way back from, you know, Maupassant, Chekhov.
Yeah. Well, the twist in the tale was what used to be, I think, the marker of the short story, and then it became the epiphany as we see it, which is more poetic and internalized.
That's right, yeah. And again, I think that ties in very well with what you were saying. Most of the time, it is about memory. Okay, I think we can open it up for questions.
There's something you'd wanted to talk about, which was the
translation.
Use of fables.
Yes.
Fables.
Yeah,
you were going to ask me. I seem to remember. Yeah. Yeah, that is something I love, and in fact, when I began to write, that was probably what first drew me. I read the work of a writer called Isaac Dinesen, and she wrote modern stories, but they had this feeling in them of fairy tales. And I think within many of us as readers, there is this desire to return to the childhood experience of the fairy tale you first read, or the legend you first heard, or the story that terrified you at night. And to be able to preserve elements of that in so-called adult fiction is something that is very attractive to me. And it's always drawn me to writers as diverse as Calvino, whom you mentioned, and Isaac Dinesen, or Marguerite Yourcenar, or even Lydia Davis. Very often you find experimenting with that sort of thing.
That's right. But can you say perhaps what are those elements that you're looking to preserve or claim?
I think quite literally it's once upon a time, or, you know, there was a merchant who lived in, and, you know, at the end of it, for example, I think I can't remember whether it was me or Isaac Denizen who ended a story with, "Does that answer your question?"
Great. I have another question about translations, but I think we can bring that in the audience question
Sure.
and answers, perhaps. We can move to the audience.
Question from the second
There's a
row?
question
I think that one was first.
by this. Please keep your questions brief. We would appreciate it very much. There was a wonderful cartoon in the New Yorker actually last week where the moderator, after turning to a discussion like this, turns to the audience and he says, we have time left for one long-winded, completely self-indulgent question that clearly has nothing to do with what we have been talking about here. So again, I'm just saying try to avoid those.
Well,
But
I would say that please keep your question to the point and about the matter under discussion. No self-indulgence here. And please raise your hand so that the volunteers can bring the mics to you.
Mr. Hussein, this refers to The Swan's Wife, your collection of short stories. And I'll just take 3 examples from there that are very diverse. And I want you to comment on the diversity of your talent. One story is The Tree at the Limit,
On the
which I think
diversity of my
makes...
material.
Sorry?
On the diversity of my material.
Genius. And The Tree at the Limit, which makes everyone look foolish because it's a very clever tale. And then you have the lovely Two Gentlemen on a Stormy Afternoon, which is a conversational. And then that wonderful fable, Ahmed Amba. So do you have anything to say about the diversity to approach your writing?
Probably my different loves in literature. Two Old Men on a Stormy Afternoon, Two Old Friends on a Stormy Afternoon is a direct modern rewrite of a story by Qurratullah Haider called, I think, Ek Makalma is the name of the story. And she used to keep telling me, if you ever sit down and translate one of my stories, this is the one I want you to do. And then she did it herself. But it's two men, I think, sitting in the Sindh Club or somewhere unnamed place in Karachi in the 50s, gossiping about the political situation. And what I wanted to do was to create two old men in Karachi in 2010, the year of various tribulations. And then the story just told itself. I heard the two men, talking in my head. I had just come back from Pakistan and heard some of my relatives speaking, and it echoed them. So that was really fun. It was also a story written under a very firm commission. My niece had to edit a magazine very fast, and it had a Pakistani section, and 2 people had just refused to contribute anything. So I just produced the story to, ghar ki laaj rakhne ke liye. But and then there was the other one was Tree at the Limit. Tree at the Limit is inspired by the paintings largely of European women who came to live in Pakistan, and how bizarre it must have seemed to them to be able to produce such paintings like that. But again, it's a story about faith and doubt. That was inspired by a photograph that was given to me by a Dutch photographer who asked me to produce a text for a book. So again, written on commission, but took longer to write because I had to work out some internal thing. But I'm fascinated by all kinds of, and this might be unfashionable to say, Islamic folklore. And much of the most beautiful stuff that we get also comes directly from the Quran, just from one image or whatever. And I think that this was one of the things that I was fascinated by. This whole thing of the tree at the limit. And then the folk stories that those images generate about the leaf on which the name of the person who's going to die is written and how they fall. So in fact, it was a very romantic thing rather than a clever response to it. The third story you wanted to know about was Aamer and Ambara. That was the centenary year of a romantic novelist called A.R. Khatun. And I had found a book by her the year before, which was of children's stories. And they're so long-winded and shaggy dog and lovely, and you can just kind of bask in them. It's like covering yourself in a big blanket. But it's the kind of story that, would you believe, my grandmother's sister used to tell when we were fasting to keep us kind of from, feeling too hungry. And then at a certain time she said, okay, it's over, go on tomorrow. And I was just sitting there and wanted to write a story like that, so it just came in minutes. But it's just the desire to find pleasure in different ways of writing, or to fulfill a brief when somebody says, could I please have a story in a week or a month or something? I'm usually very late with it, so I draw on my repertoire of tales that I have in my head and do whatever I can with them.
Hello. Sir, this is Nasir Sumro. I'd like to ask you about the lane that you are living in right now. How much do you depict? Because when you are living in Karachi, a country with so much of chaos and crisis, and then living in London, how much the lane rubs off in you? And my second question is, which is connected to it, is how much writer speaks of himself into the story, because life is a tragedy and everybody has to face the fact that it's tragedy, and how much you write in your story about the tragedies that you have gone through.
Yeah, I'll answer the first one second. I'll answer the second one first. I think in a way, sometimes the most autobiographical of your work is the one that's not about you at all. So some of the stories that I've written, which have seemed to be about characters so distant from me in time and place, have had some of my greatest griefs in them. Like, for example, never having had children of my own appeared in a story. And I suddenly was rereading it for something when it was being translated, and I was so shocked that this had come in. When I've written any story that appears to be about something that's called myself, it's always entirely a fiction. It's just that I've lived a certain life in a certain moment, and I can use I'm using the word trajectories too much today, and this is not a lecture. The events of my life, the chronologies of my life make it easier to structure a story at certain times, you know, and allow those things that I've lived through rather than lived to come into the story through the eyes of a first-person narrator. In a sense, I'm giving you that tautological answer. Everything is autobiographical, nothing is entirely autobiographical. And the biggest lies are books that people call autobiographies. When they call them a memoir of my life, they're just full of lies. Get a brother and a sister to tell you the same story. They're completely different. The first question, could you paraphrase it for me slightly?
Sorry?
About England, shifting to England, how much that influenced me. Well, more and more, because, you know, every year I've lived there longer, so the stories that I write tend to be very influenced by what's happening around me. And I find that very rarely does something happen, even in a newspaper, that has a significant impact on the city that doesn't appear in my fiction in some way or another. So if for a week we have bomb scares, you'll just suddenly find that my story has a bomb scare, and I don't even know that it's happening, it just comes in. But yeah, it's conditioned by the way we live. And when sometimes people talk to us, I can see another, you know, eminent Britain-based Pakistani writer in the audience, Hussein Aamer. And what people who live here don't realize is that we're also very imbricated and implicated in the politics of life there. And we're constantly having to deal with two sets of political sensibilities. What happens at what was, you know, where we live now, and what happened in the country we left behind.
No?
Okay, sorry. Hello? My question is that how writers see things, and what is the secret of your life?
Sorry, secret of...
How writers see things, and what is the secret of your life?
What was the secret of your life?
Secret that...
Secret of his life?
Yeah.
What's the secret of my
That,
life?
Have fun.
You know, you
Well,
have got...
It
secret is-
isn't a secret, but I think that many of us who've been through this, if you're taken away from the place you've lived in all your life, for no fault of your own and through no choice of your own, that leaves a terrible scar. It might sound like a cliche, but being pulled away from what you were familiar with and being completely exposed to something unfamiliar leaves a shock that is never, never quite something you recover from. You lose a sense of place, you lose a sense of language, not language in the sense of mother tongue, but what you hear around you. And you know, for some whim, I ended up in boarding school in India for 1.5 years, having left behind Karachi at the age of 13. I think that is probably the open secret of my life, that losing the place I grew up in left a longing that's always, you know, something I am able to fulfill. I'm doing it right now, but it keeps bringing me back here. And yet it makes me feel I don't really belong anywhere at all. And I never will. So it's,
how writers see things. First question was how writers see things.
How
Writers-
writers see things.
Yeah.
Bilal will answer that.
Thanks, Aamer. There is no general answer to that. So, you know, I think that it's probably best that, you know, we keep the conversation specific. Okay, there's a question there.
Sir, you speak of the altercations of the mind. So, to what extent do you believe that the human mind has been romanticized to some extent or the other?
The human mind has been romanticized.
I think you mean to what extent the human mind has absorbed romanticism? I think
Or has in literature been romanticized?
Yes, of course it has, but I think we need that as well. We've had wonderful literatures or writings that are documentary. I mean, if you look at the Western tradition, you have Zola. If you look at Urdu poetry, you have Nazir Akbaravadi writing stuff that's very rough-hewn and unromantic as well. But without the romantic imagination, I think a lot of beauty wouldn't come to us. And I do believe that beauty, just like irony, have aesthetic purposes. So.
Okay. Other questions? There's a question back there.
Hi, sir. Sir, what do you feel about satire and the limits of satire? Or have you ever wanted to write satire?
Yeah, I guess there are satirical elements in that story that I was asked about the two old friends on a stormy afternoon. I mean, I like humor. And I don't know what forms that humor might take, but I think that little, elements of humor delight me as a reader, and they certainly entertain me when I'm writing. The problem with humor is that you never know how much of it will be conveyed to the reader until you actually see them laughing out loud. And it is a great experience sometimes to see people laughing when they hear you read or when they read your work, and you're not even aware of it's being funny. But I mean, satire as raison d'être, as some reason for me to write, no, that isn't so. I think I'm just probably too melancholy a personality for that. But at times.
Aamer, do you want to speak to the question of translation and translating works across languages?
Yeah, no, I'm a great believer in translation. I think that I've talked about reading in all these languages, but without having read translations from the Japanese by Tanizaki or Chinese of Lucian, etc., I would never have been the reader I am, which of course is what makes you the writer I am. I'm not myself a good translator. It's a talent I singularly lack. I mean, I know Rukhsana Ahmed has the talent, you have the talent and the skill. I have had the experience of trying to put my own stories that I wrote in Urdu into English. And when I write in Urdu, I don't think in English. I think in Urdu, or I think in pictures and kind of try to draw the words from my vocabulary of Urdu, much of which is incipient. So maybe that's some kind of process of translation going on there. But I've co-translated, and in this particular era or period, I was prevailed upon to put my Urdu stories into English versions, which I hadn't wanted to do. So in one case, I rewrote it entirely. It just couldn't be the same as the Urdu story, which then becomes a cheat. In the other case, I did very literal versions and translated them, passed them on to someone who knows no Urdu, and she polished them, saying that she would remove from them anything that didn't work for an English reader. I think that was an interesting experience. One of them you asked me about earlier today, Knotted Tongue.
That's right.
Finally, because my mother is entirely and completely bilingual in a way I'm not, she can think and read with equal fluency in both languages. I gave her a funny story I had written and asked her to do an English version of it. And I think she really got it well. But the thing about my mother is that she's faithful to the spirit of the story and totally, completely unfaithful to the surface. Because she says, no, this line should actually sound like Jane Austen. And then she'll kill herself getting it to sound like Jane Austen, which it doesn't in the end, but it sounds like Mama trying to sound like Jane Austen and putting an Urdu story into. And it makes me laugh, it really makes me laugh. There was this example of a line I had in my story, which was, "Main koi khudai faujdar to nahi."
That's right, yes.
And she really struggled over that line, and she brought it as, "I'm not one of God's little soldiers." And I just watched her come up with this line. It was delightful.
It's lovely.
And somebody said she should have said one of the God Squad or something like that. But she said, no,
this is perfect, actually. Yeah.
And she keeps on coming up with things like that. Like, for example, the word trickle, which is not a word I use. In one of my stories, she's also done the title story of my forthcoming book, 37 Bridges. And she used this word trickle for a body of water that she and I both know in Delhi. And I hadn't used this word. She said, but it is a trickle. Can I use it? And I said, of course
It's
you
perfect.
can. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
So I've watched the translator at work. And she's 90, so it's amazing to watch her, when she does this.
It's quite remarkable. Wow. Okay, there's a question back there. The gentleman right at the very end.
Thank you. This is a slightly different question, and you don't have to answer it if you don't feel comfortable about it. It's about the freedom of speech and artistic freedom. I'd like you to like your views on the recent attack in Paris on the Charlie Hebdo magazine. How do you feel about that, living in the West where there is freedom of speech and writers push the boundaries as much as they can?
I think that I'll answer this very much as a fiction writer. I think that what deeply concerns me every time something like this happens is the impact it has. I know that we're not even supposed to say this, but on the ordinary so-called Muslim on the street, somebody who's Muslim by name, by appearance, by ancestry, even by belief, regardless of what their private beliefs might be. And the amount of hysteria it generates in the press, it is actually frightening. It's oppressive when you live with it. When you finally reach the moment where you realize that this will calm down and people do live together, they do live in harmony. I think that England is a place in which many cases a kind of balance has been achieved between discrimination and solidarity. It gets better as time goes on. But there's a certain fear that arises. And the worst moment is when you're sitting at dinner with friends of yours who are not normally aware of your difference, and you definitely get this clear question of, are you with us or are you against us? Many of us sit there not knowing what the terms of togetherness or withness or againstness are. I think that's all I can really say about this.
It's a great answer.
But it's a lot of... Roxana, I would actually really like you to comment on it, if you feel free to do so.
Can we have the mic over here, please? Here, yeah.
Hi, Aamer and Bilal. I think that was, can you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah,
Can you
so-
guys-
Yeah.
That's it.
That was a wonderful presentation and a great question and answer session. And I'm fascinated by the Charlie Hebdo question because I'm afraid my position on it is no freedom of speech without a sense of responsibility. So I just feel, people who create these polarities don't have to live in complex situations which they have been responsible for creating. The Charlie Hebdo cartoons and the attack were not just a response to an artistic product,
Absolutely.
but actually deeply connected with colonial histories across the world.
Deprivation, poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunities, random racism.
Exactly. But can I take you back to your work with my question? I'd really like to know if there has ever been a review that has really wounded you deeply, that has impacted you in such a way that you want to change direction? Or are you able to shrug them all off?
When people review me in certain ways, much of the time I find it very amusing. Because you sort of think, how could they get it so spectacularly wrong? So of course, the sense of your missing skin is there, because if we didn't have thin skins, we wouldn't shut ourselves up in rooms to write. I think I was hurt once, but it certainly never changed my way of thinking. There's a very fine reviewer a writer called Stevie Davis, who's also very big on the LGBT, the gay woman writer and so on and so forth. And for some reason, I thought that she would be more sensitive to a particular novel I wrote. And she starts off setting up this incredible paraphernalia of, the beauties and the wonders of my novel and how I'm influenced by Shah Abdul Latif. And she'd bothered to find out who Shah Abdul Latif was, and, the Persian poetry and this and that and the other. And suddenly she says, but like clouds, this novel goes nowhere. It just drifts. Characters walk in and they walk out and they just die. They don't develop. But I suppose that's what we expect from someone who calls himself a short story writer but is obviously a poet. Now, Shahrukh, my sister, whom you also know, we're a sort of small literary community of Pakistanis who write in English in Britain. We all know each other well. We share problems with each other quite a bit as well. So Shahrukh said, actually, this is backhanded flattery. But it was for a day and a half, it was painful because she'd so spectacularly missed the fact that that book was about somebody in pain for various reasons, who's able to deal with the loss of not one, but two loves in his life, both to disease, one to mental disease and one to physical disease. I don't call that not developing. So,
Thank you.
Okay. We have, how much time do we have left?
5 minutes, 6 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay.
I'll
maybe
make
you-
it 6.
Okay, 6. Okay, right at the back.
Hello, hi. Thank you for the talk. I got to learn a lot of stuff. Being an aspiring writer myself, I have a few questions. What's the unifying factor? Is there one thing that you're trying to explore? Are there several things? If there are several things, then what inspires you towards them? If it's okay, I'll stop.
No, it's one, actually. I can sum it all up in one line from a Persian poem from the 60s. If the birds are always in search of a blue direction, why should I stop? Why?
How beautiful.
And I think that is
Yeah.
what it's about.
How beautiful.
Yeah. And even longing, what we call longing, when people talk about longing as always being connected to loss, for me, longing is for what is there. Just as I talked about returning to the city I lost, it's always ahead of me. I can always come back. So.
That's a gorgeous thought. Thank you for that. Okay, another question. Okay, we have a question here, Tanweer Anjum.
Tanweer Anjum had a question? Yes.
Aamer, you started writing in Urdu. Are you still doing that, or?
The last story I wrote in Urdu was in, I think, July or August, and I'm just waiting for it to be published. It's with
Just
Asif Faraki.
one story. So why did you do that, or is that an impulse? Or
No, not at all. No, not at all. I just always knew I would. And it just so happened that Fatma Hassan, I was having a conversation with her, and she said, you just need to sit and write the way you speak. Don't write the way other people write. Just write the way you speak. So I sat down and wrote this very short story, and then I wrote another very short one, trying to write the way I speak, but I couldn't. It was so full of Persian influences that it was incredible, because I'm quite steeped in Persian as well. So I think it comes into, it's between some hybrid of spoken language and Persian poetry. So, and I want to continue to do it. And the great thing is that sometimes stories just suggest themselves to me in Urdu now. So. But for that, I need to keep on reading Urdu. When I stop reading Urdu, the inspiration dries up as well.
Okay, maybe one final question if somebody has it.
I think we're done.
Okay, I think we're done. Thank you so much, Aamer.
Thank you so much, Bilal.
And thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Aamer will be available to sign books.
Are there any books outside? I didn't check.
Yes, they are.
Yes, they are.
Okay, certainly.
Okay, great.
Delight.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to the audience.